Hi, I'm Steve Wilson-Briggs. Today I'm speaking to Mr. Florian Shasky, the head librarian here at Sequoia High School. He has a tremendously interesting background. I believe I might be the first one that he's privileged with the opportunity to interview him. And so thank you very much for that, Mr. Shasky.
Thank you.
So with that said, I'd like to jump right in, if you don't mind, if you're sharing a bit about your background.
Of course, and thank you for the opportunity to have the interview. I'm reluctant to give interviews. I don't give interviews to press or film or anything, so this is kind of a new venture for me.
And it did take quite a bit of cajoling to get you to do this, and thank you for yielding.
Okay, so I will start off by saying I was raised in the state of Oregon. My father settled in Medford, Oregon. He was a physician, surgeon, and I grew up in Medford, Oregon. So I had sort of a semi-rural background, which suited me very, very well. And then I went off to college and university. I traveled and went to school in Switzerland, in England, at the University of Laval in Quebec, Canada. So I had a very diverse education in terms of location of where I went to school. And finally, I went to graduate school at the University of Washington, where I earned a master's degree in library science. I started out in the English department because I thought I wanted to be an English teacher. Of course, my father wanted me to be a doctor, and I said no to that, even though I participated in surgeries with the patient's permission and got a sense of science by doing some of those things. So I wanted to be an English professor. I was just not suited to sit around and talk about hunting down image clusters in John Milton's verse. I was more interested and more curious, which is the real operative word here, about the world of books and learning and how those were applied to scholarship. So I switched over and went into the library science program at the University of Washington, got a master's degree, and then went to England and did further graduate work for 2.5 years at the University of Exeter. So that's sort of a capsule form of sort of early academic and social life.
Now, I happen to know that we've skipped a bunch of things, and I know that early on, and through your whole life, you've had some really interesting, surprising jobs, and so I was curious, hopeful that you might share some of those experience, from being a lumberman to there's a million other things, and so I'm hoping that you might share a little bit about some of those interesting occupations along the path to becoming a librarian.
Well, everything that I've done has prepared me for the work I do at Sequoia. And that might be a cliche statement, but it's true. So I did work in the woods. I was a timber faller. I was trained. My father-in-law owned a logging company, and he thought that I should have a taste of what it was like if I wanted to marry his daughter. And so I said, sure.
As I recall, you were a very young man.
I was quite young, yes. I was in my early 20s.
Okay.
And so I did that for a short time, and I learned about the woods and logging and the whole culture of that. It was pretty wild. We were logging on the Oregon-California border. In those days, it was kind of a no man's land. Even the highway patrol and the sheriff wouldn't go in there. It was every man for himself. So that was an experience.
And you also wound up driving the truck.
I drove logging trucks for a short time until I got just terrified of it and finally put one in the ditch and said, this is the end of my driving.
Any chance I can twist your arm to share a few other occupations before we jump into the second part of this interview?
As a young man, I did lawn work. I mean, so many of us in those days cut lawns for a few dollars here and there. And my father said, well, you're going to expand your lawn cutting. You're going to get into landscaping and cleaning yards and so forth. And so I did, and I hired some of my schoolmates in high school to help me out. And one of the houses that we cleaned up, the gardens, happened to be owned by a contractor. And he saw the work I did, and he said, I have a place for you in my company if you want to join me and learn how to do buildings and work with concrete and steel and wood and framing and everything else. So I did. So I spent some more time learning how to be a carpenter, learning how to pour concrete and those kinds of things, which were skills that I found very useful later on in life.
Now, a minute ago, you shared a bit about your background leading to becoming a librarian. But as I recall, I've talked to you a bunch about your background, and your background takes a lot of twists and turns. As I recall, you didn't go right into becoming a librarian. I don't think you would become a librarian for quite some time, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I spent time in England doing postgraduate research, and from there I applied for a position at the University of San Francisco. I had an uncle in San Francisco, so I knew that there was one familiar face anyway. And they wrote to me while I was still in England and said, we don't have a program. At that time I was interested in rare books in libraries, rare books and manuscripts. They said, we don't have a rare book program or even a rare book room, but we have a collection of rare books, and please come and see us. Maybe we could do something. So I went to San Francisco. They interviewed me, they hired me, and I designed rare book room for them, raised the money and everything else. That was a good experience. And established the rare book collection as it should be at the University of San Francisco. I was the first rare book librarian there.
Is the rare book room structure still there?
It is. It's the Countess Donahoe room and Donahoe Murphy room, and it's elegant, it's nice, it's lovely. I'm very proud of it, and they have some good collections that we got while I was there.
You also worked in was it Palo Alto library, am I mistaken?
Palo Alto.
Stanford?
From the University of San Francisco, I went to Stanford University and worked there as chief of special collections for, I think it was maybe 6 years or so.
How did you finally come to Sequoia High School?
Well, I came to Sequoia High School in an accidental roundabout way. Following my tenure at Stanford, I went back into the antiquarian book trade, and I had my own business selling rare books, manuscripts, publishing, doing evaluations of collections and so forth.
Completely private?
Yes, sir. And that was exciting. Things went pretty well for a number of years. The Japanese were buying from me, and that was a good sign. And then the market kind of went off, and they slowed down their purchases, so things weren't going quite as well as I thought they ought to. So I retired from that enterprise, and I went to a party and I met a lady who had been a secretary at Sequoia. She had retired, but she kept in touch with people here. And she said, Florian, for crying out loud, I'm just happy I saw you because Sequoia is looking for a librarian. You have a library degree, you have an English degree. They're also looking for someone to teach English. You can do that. Go over there and talk to them. And she shushed me out. And so I came here, talked to Al Aramadea. That was in the year 2000. And I think he interviewed me on a Thursday, and Monday they made me an offer. It was the end of August. They were getting desperate because school was starting up and they needed somebody at the helm.
That was back about 2000?
That was year 2000.
Now, at this point, I'm guessing that viewers might think that they have a pretty good handle on, you know, some of your background, but I know that you've left out some interesting details, and one of the details is your experience with security defense technology, and I was curious if you might be able to give us a glimpse into some of that. What you find reasonable, and
What can I say? While I was at Sequoia, I tried, and I still do this because I'm still at Sequoia, I tried to connect people in industry, people in the community, and science, medicine, and whatever, with teachers and students who were interested in a particular specialty. Because I've been around a while and because I'm a very curious person, I've sought people out. And so in one case, when a teacher said to me, do you know of any young entrepreneurs that I could have come to my class, it's a business class, to give an example of what it's like to be a real entrepreneur in Silicon Valley? And I thought about it and I said, yes, I do know a young man who is charismatic, who is well-spoken, who is successful, and I think he will be happy to come and address your class. And that gentleman was Mr. Douglas Franco. If the name resonates with you a little bit, the surname, it's because his son is the actor James Franco. So I knew Doug through parties and in Palo Alto, and actually we lived in the same general area of Palo Alto. So he came to the class, and he told them about various ventures that he had that had failed, and then those that were successful. And he says, I'm just doing a new one now called SecureBox Corporation. And he said it involves an invention developed at Lawrence Livermore Labs that involves micropower impulse radar systems. And he says, I'm going to adapt it for securing cargo containers. And so when he said that, after the class, I said, Doug, I've had some experience with cargo containers because I used to ship lots of rare books and libraries to the Japanese, to Canada, and all over, and I had my own security system. He said, tell me about it. So that led to my involvement with SecureBox, my involvement with Lawrence Livermore Labs, where I would go over there with Doug and meet them and talk to the engineers and work on security issues with SecureBox Corporation. And then I knew a fellow who had been in the intelligence community. He was retired. And I said to him, you know, there's a challenge over there. They're trying to build this system to secure containers. Why don't you come with me? Let's see if we can foil it. Because that's what they're trying to get outside opinions. So this gentleman went with me and introduced him to Doug. Everybody got along. He went over there, and two of the people actually had known him from previous work that had been done, so he was welcomed warmly. And he and I figured out how to defeat the system. And we told them that. And they said to us, but that's classified. How did you figure it out? And we said, well, we've had some experience, so leave it at that. Anyway, we were welcomed. So that was a journey that I took while I was still working here at Sequoia. On the weekends and evenings, I would work with Doug Franco and his partner and this other gentleman, helping them get their system up and running.
are you still kind of involved?
Well, Doug Franco sadly died suddenly with a heart attack a few years ago, and then the whole thing kind of just dissolved.
Now, here at Sequoia, I understand you have some interesting thoughts, or some interesting thoughts about the challenges and maybe the future of librarianship. And I was curious if you might be willing to share some of those challenges and kind of where you see, the future of high schools going and some of the challenges present in that whole area. Sorry for the awkward question.
Well, no, it's not an awkward question. I think I understand what you're asking. It's complicated, and I don't have a simple solution. I don't even have a complicated solution. So what I will give you will be observations and viewpoints. And my observations and viewpoints on high school libraries may not be in the mainstream thinking of many high school librarians.
All the better.
But there again, I bring a few more years of experience in many different fields to this position, and therefore I think I have more of a palette to work with, if you will, when I put these things together. So, high school libraries are evolving, but libraries always evolve. They never stay static. Even the library at Alexandria, before it was destroyed, was evolving. New things come out and things evolve. My concern is that the current evolution of libraries toward lots and lots of digitization and technology, that whole area is driving students in such a way that there are two consequences at least. One, they are developing what I call the shallows. That's from a book by Nicholas Carr, by the way, The Shallows, How the Internet Has Affected Our Brains. And basically what I see is that students want instant gratification with information. They want it fast. They don't want to read through an entire book. They want to go on the internet, which they're comfortable floating around the internet. And so that's where they're getting their information. They're not comfortable looking at a book because they don't do it. And so they're missing out on a lot of depth that could be achieved by going through a book. As an aside, I might say that I give a seminar to the International Baccalaureate students on how to do research, and we talk about books and primary sources. So some students are exposed to that. So the shallows, that's one condition. The other condition that I've observed is the one that I call when less is more, how are students to succeed in their research? What do I mean by less is more? There is more information available to students and staff and scholars, but students have less access to it because it now costs money to get at it. In other words, there are lots of companies, Gale and other companies, that sell databases to schools, and schools buy them because they don't have big collections, and the public library has tossed out all of their old magazines and a lot of their books, so they don't have a lot that they used to have. And now schools have to pay for information that used to be virtually free. And so, yes, there's more information being produced, but the students don't have access to as much as we did when we used to go in the libraries and go in the basement and walk for miles among the stacks and pull out 19th century English magazines and just delight in finding something like that on Dickens or something. That whole procedure, that whole exercise, that experience is virtually gone now for young students at high school. And I think it's rather a shame. And so the other thing is students are not exposed to primary sources in the primary source format. They're exposed to primary sources on these databases, but they're electronic versions. And the electronic version of a letter does not give you the same interpretation as an original letter. And we have some original 18th century American historical letters in our collection at Sequoia because we have the Robert C. Powell Endowment for the IB students, but all students benefit from this. And so students they don't see original sources like they used to. They see digital versions, which are totally different. The other thing is Google, of course, is copying books, millions of books, and they want to build this virtual library, I guess, of every book that exists. And so when I had this International Baccalaureate seminar, I held up an 1887 journal of the Royal Geological Society of England. And I said, here's an article in here about crossing the Sudan in 1887. And I said, I doubt very much that you will find this in Google Books. I said, I doubt you will find it. I didn't say you won't find it. A student put his paw up in the air and said, I've got it. I found it. I said, okay, I wagered $10 that you couldn't find it. Now, let's look at your version that Google has digitized with the original. And I opened it up and I said, here is the folding map that's germane to the article. It's the folding map in the Google version. He said, no. I said, you get $5. That's a small detail, but it's a significant detail. You don't know what is missing in some of these things. The other thing that I see is that students need to pay more attention to preservation of early artifacts and preservation of electronic texts and so on. I recently read an article that said that a Supreme Court justice was reading through briefs and so on, and half the links were no longer active. They just disappeared. And so we're losing a lot of digital information, and who knows where it goes or what happens. In contrast, books printed in the 15th century are still around because the paper has not deteriorated. It's still good. It's rag content paper. So this whole idea of preserving original sources and knowing what they are is terribly important, I think, for us to understand our culture. When I was a graduate student, and when you were a student perhaps, it was very, very simple. You had manuscripts to work with, you had printed books to work with. Now, students have to navigate in the world of manuscripts, printed books, and digital versions. They have to be conversant with all three different categories. That's not necessarily an easy task. But to be thorough in your research, you need to explore those, for the most part, in many, many cases. So that's something else that needs to be addressed, I think.
I think you said at the outset that you offer no quick fixes or no complex fixes. But I hope in some way this conversation kind of advances an awareness of some of the issues, and maybe collectively we can get closer to a resolution to some of these problems. I'm particularly bothered by the expense that you mentioned that schools have to incur to get some of the data that you mentioned. Turning a corner now, I'm curious, kind of you as a human being, curious to know what matters most to you. It's kind of sort of a signature question that I try to ask everybody, just so we can get an essence of who is the man.
Well, what matters to me, of course, is my health, my children, my family, my friends, and Sequoia, the students here. Those things matter a lot to me.
Where do you see yourself, or where would you like to be in 5 years?
That's almost a trick question. In 5 years, I will be just exactly where I'm supposed to be, not where I thought I would be.
That's your final answer?
Well, that's sort of that's like the answer I give students when they say, "How's your day going, Mr. Shasky?" And I say, "You know, my day is going just the way it's supposed to, not the way I thought it would." And so it literally is one day at a time. Who knows? I mean, I have a lot of interests. I do metal sculpture. I'll probably in 5 years be doing more of that work. Reading, maybe some more writing.
Mr. Florian Shasky, I'm so honored and privileged that you agreed to do this interview with me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.